how important was Prime Minister Modi's latest ASEAN outreach, his visits to Singapore and Brunei, and with Southeast Asia stuck between US-China contestations, can India step in? Can India revive its ties with the Near East, particularly with this new quest for energy and semiconductors? Hello and welcome to Worldview at The Hindu with me, Suhasini Haider. This week, we're going to speak about a subject we don't often look at because we're always looking at conflicts and other important issues in India's foreign policy, but this is no less important. India's ties with its Near East neighbours, the ASEAN countries, the 10 ASEAN countries located there, and particularly those visits he made in the past week. In fact, it was part of a number of outreaches to the region just since the election, so the last few months. Modi, as we said, has visited Brunei and Singapore. He was due, in fact, to visit Thailand for the BIMSTEC Summit, but that got cancelled as the government there was dismissed and the new government was taking time to settle in. He will travel, in fact, to Laos in October for the ASEAN-India Summit and meet more of the leaders of the neighbourhood, as well as the East Asia Summit. Of course, that includes countries like the US and Australia, Japan, and other neighbourhood countries. Second, New Delhi has hosted the Prime Ministers of Vietnam, Pham and Chinh, and the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, also just in the past 2 months, and those were fairly big visits in Delhi. President Murmu travelled to Timor Leste on a visit also out east to New Zealand and Fiji. So let's just tell you about the takeaways from each of these. In Brunei, the Prime Minister's visit was the first bilateral by an Indian Prime Minister. Of course, Dr. Manmohan Singh, the previous Prime Minister, had visited in 2013 for an ASEAN-India Summit, but that was multilateral. On this visit, Prime Minister Modi and the Sultan of Brunei discussed a number of issues. So let's just take a look at what those issues were. The first on strategic issues and enhancing defense cooperation. Of course, at present, India and Brunei don't have a strategic partnership, but they do participate in military exercises. They're working on a joint working group on defense cooperation to try and institutionalize the relationship. Of course, the Sultan of Brunei has visited India often, and the two countries really have a very historical background to their relationship. That mosque that Prime Minister Modi visited in Brunei actually modeled on the Taj Mahal built by the current Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah's father. They also spoke about strategic issues, and Prime Minister Modi very specifically in a banquet speech took aim, it seemed, at China over its disputes in the South China Sea with claimants including Brunei.
हम अनक्लोज जैसे अंतर्राष्ट्रीय कानूनों के तहत फ्रीडम ऑफ नेविगेशन और ओवरफ्लाइट्स का समर्थन करते हैं। हम सहमत हैं कि इस क्षेत्र में कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट पर सहमति बने। हम विस्तारवाद नहीं, विकासवाद की नीति का समर्थन करते हैं।
We support freedom of navigation and overflight under international laws like UNCLOS. We agree that a code of conduct should be finalized for this region. We support the policy of development and not expansionism.
They signed an MOU renewing space cooperation. This is at present the big cooperation between them. It includes research and training, and Brunei hosts what is called a telemetry tracking command center for ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization. They discussed increasing energy supplies from Brunei, which really have dropped sharply in the past couple of years as India has bumped up its intake of Russian oil. And they discussed a long-term contract for LNG. Finally, the subject of trade is a tricky one where despite India's trade with other ASEAN countries doubling over the past decade, trade with Brunei has actually stayed the same or even declined from hovering around $500 million. It is now down to about $200 million last year. In comparison, if you want to look, China-Brunei trade stands at about $3 billion. That's the highest that Brunei does. Mr. Modi's visit to the region was a study in contrast. So given his next visit was to Singapore, and remember Prime Minister Lawrence Wong was only sworn in a few months ago compared to the Sultan of Brunei, who is now the world's longest serving monarch. He's been in power since the 1960s. So let's turn to Singapore and some of the takeaways there. Singapore is, of course, India's biggest trading partner in the ASEAN grouping. Bilateral trade stands at about $35 billion. It's seen a 2.5 times increase since they signed what was called the SICA agreement in 2005, and about 9,000 Indian companies are registered and operating in Singapore. So it's an important trading hub for India. Singapore is also India's biggest source of foreign direct investment globally from around the world. A cumulative $160 billion has come in since 2000, although the levels of investment dropped a sharp 30% last year. In fact, you can see more about that in an interview I did with Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan a couple of months ago. India and Singapore also have the strongest strategic partnership really amongst ASEAN countries in that sense, the highest number of military exchanges between them and exercises as well, and they're consistently meeting over a number of formats. The highlight of this visit was the signing of a semiconductor ecosystem partnership, along with MOUs on digital cooperation, health and skill development. Modi also visited Singapore's AEM factory. So let's talk a little bit about why this pitch to semiconductors was really important. What you should know is that semiconductors are used in all electronic devices. They're crucial for India's growth as a high-tech manufacturing hub in particular, something India has been working on and has put about $20 billion into in planning. The second thing you should know is that Singapore produces 10% of semiconductors worldwide. It's a $588 billion industry worldwide, so that's a huge chunk. Singapore is also a major player, if you like, in things like IC, integrated circuit design, and packaging, and wafer fabrication. Wafer is what those semiconductor chips are made up of, and it's built that industry over 6 decades. But now with growing land and labor issues as well as US-China contestation, Singapore really looking to diversify its semiconductor manufacturing and invest in other countries. And this comes at a time that India is seeking semiconductor investment, trying to set up these factories, whether it's from Taiwan or other countries. Now, the MOU between them actually says that both sides seek resilient semiconductor supply chains. This is a reference really to de-risking the US-China rivalry for the region, including the US's own protectionist moves like the CHIPS Act and China's predatory practices. So what really are the challenges for India in its outreach to the East? Everything that I've mentioned so far means that relations should really be fairly smooth without those challenges, but it's important to know what they are. To begin with, and this is important, a few years ago, India opted out of the ASEAN-led RCEP agreement. That's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And this is something that, both the ASEAN countries as well as some of the other countries in the region like Japan, like Australia, all of whom are part of RCEP were really hoping India would do. So there's been disappointment in the ASEAN region. It's also led to some questions about India's reliability in negotiations because we continued those negotiations for more than 6 years. India's trade with ASEAN nations has grown to $120 billion last year, but ASEAN's largest partner by far remains China, about $722 billion in bilateral trade. There's $440 billion with the US in 2022 as well. So considering the proximity, it is still a little behind. You must also remember, look at the map. Maritime connectivity to ASEAN countries is historic, but India has been hampered on land connectivity and still remains so due to tensions in the northeast as well as in Myanmar, which connect India on the proposed tri-national highway that would lead India and connect it seamlessly to Southeast Asia. Of course, India has now taken a divergent position on engaging the Myanmar military junta post the coup there in 2021. So it has a different position from ASEAN in a sense. In fact, India even has spoken to, invited the minister in Myanmar to the BIMSTEC Summit, to meetings in Delhi. ASEAN does not engage with anything but the bureaucratic officials over there. Fifth, even though the region hosts many US bases, ASEAN countries, especially in recent years, have adopted a more cautious approach on Chinese aggression against Taiwan, on US-China contestations, and on India's participation in the Quad. New Delhi will really have to coordinate its strategic position carefully if it means to stick to its motto of ASEAN centrality. It's something Prime Minister Modi spoke about again in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, a sensitive issue, communal tensions in India have been met with rising concerns from several ASEAN countries, including Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Oftentimes, India has pushed back on those. But remember, those are also multicultural, multi-religious countries. They have a large Indian diaspora and they don't want to see a spillover effect of some of those tensions in their countries as well. So what's Worldview's take? India's ties with ASEAN countries really date back more than 10 centuries with engagement on trade, culture, religion, as well as people migrating there. India has made many restarts on its ASEAN engagement. If you look at the Look East policy of the 1990s, Act East in 2015, but until it breaks the cycle of neglecting the region when other issues come up, it will be hard to sustain the obvious advantages of cooperation with them. Above all, India could really take a leaf from ASEAN's success in its groupings like SAARC and BIMSTEC. So let's get you some reading recommendations, and I enjoyed all of the books I'm talking about here. The first is The ASEAN Miracle by Kishore Mehbubani and Jeffrey Seng. It's very important. It's by a Singaporean diplomat. He's not always liked. He says a lot of things on the US-China competition, for example, that are unpopular in India. But his books really are very well researched. He's also written Has the West Lost It? And Living in the Asian Century. Then there's East of India, South of China, a book by Amitav Acharya, well worth reading, talking about Singapore particularly, but also the region. Then there's The Merlion and the Ashoka, Singapore-India Strategic Ties, edited by Aneet Mukherjee. A lot of very interesting articles in there. Another book like that called 30 Years of ASEAN-India Relations Towards the Indo-Pacific. This is edited by Prabir De and really has a broader view of the 3 decades. A book I found interesting, written by an Indonesian diplomat who was also foreign minister for a while. It's called Does ASEAN Matter? There's a lot of questions about ASEAN. This is A View from Within by Martin Natalegawa. As I said, he's an Indonesian diplomat. I'd also recommend a few other books on semiconductors in particular. One is called Chip War by Chris Miller, and I have spoken about this one before, but there's one with an Indian perspective called When the Chips Are Down by Pranay Kotasthane and Abhiram Manchi. Very well worth reading. And finally, an evergreen, I've spoken about this often, called Great Game East by Bertel Lintner. All well worth reading and brushing up on your understanding of India's outreach to the ASEAN. But that's all we have time for here on Worldview. From the team, thanks for watching.